This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com. As part of our ongoing series on financial repression, I have Mark O'Brien joining us from London this morning. Mark is the founder and research director of the well-recognized Goldcore, which is a well-respected international bullion dealer as experts in and the executional logistics within precious metals market. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Gordon. Thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate you joining us. I've been following Goldcorp's work and your writings for years, and it's first rate. And if any of our listeners haven't visited your site, it's a must reading.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, and I've come across you a few times over the years as well, and enjoyed the videos. And I even watched Ronald Peter Stoffel overnight, and it was an excellent video, excellent interview. So well done.
Thank you. In his in Gold We Trust report, we think it's just first rate.
Absolutely, it's a must read.
Read for the research that he does, and nobody does finer charts in the world than Ronnie does. So absolutely,
yeah.
Mark, maybe we could just begin with you giving our listeners a bit of your background, how you got involved with Goldcorp and founding it, and what Goldcorp is involved with, for those that aren't familiar.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. So it's sort of a strange circuitous route. My background is actually not in economics or finance per se. I had a BA in history from University College Dublin, but much of it was actually two parts. It was Greek and Roman civilization, and then there was the history part, and much of that was actually economic and monetary history. So I suppose from that education, I had an awareness of, I suppose, the cyclical nature of all things, and the booms and busts that we tend to go throughout history, and how gold has retained a value, particularly in more recent times in the face of paper currencies and the typical ongoing devaluation of fiat currencies that you tend to see. So that was what I did in university, and really enjoyed it, and I have a passion and a huge interest in history, and I think it's a great. It doesn't dictate the future, but I think there's lots of lessons that can be learned, and unfortunately we don't tend to learn the lessons of history, to our downfall. So, but subsequent to that, I actually have thought about going into teaching or lecturing. I did have a passion, as I said, and I thought that might be where I'd end up. But my father had a recruitment business, and he basically tempted me with a good salary and the promise of good holidays. I wanted to do a bit of backpacking and traveling around the world in my mid-20s as well. So that allowed me to do that, which was absolutely wonderful. And just traveling the world was a huge education in terms of economically what was happening. And I saw things happening in different countries in terms of what the IMF were doing, very similar to what's happening in Greece today and in other countries in terms of the austerity that was imposed and all the rest. And I didn't become politicized per se, but I just became more aware of what was happening, and I suppose the risks of debt, of excess debt in the system. And I could see that very much the talk was about the third world or the developing world, and all the debt was there. But then I was seeing, well, hang on a second, there's quite a lot of debt in the first world and in the Western world as well. And I say, well, if that can happen to them, potentially that can happen to us. So I suppose I started becoming a little bit nervous about it in the early 2000s, or late 1990s, early 2000s, and started reading things. And then the internet was, there was more and more great content on the internet, and just bought every book there was about gold and the history of gold and educate myself in that regard. And I started buying gold in a private capacity, and to cut a long story short, I basically realized that there was no one in Ireland, and the people in the UK weren't offering gold in a particularly sophisticated way. And even in the US, I felt there was very few people who were sort of positioning gold as a diversification in their portfolio. It tended to be sort of the end of the world is nigh, buy gold coins. And, while I accept there are big risks out there, our philosophy was more about diversification, have gold as a diversified portfolio, and it's also a hedge against worst case scenarios, so you can't discount that. But we felt it wasn't being positioned vis-a-vis mainstream assets such as equities and bonds, wasn't being positioned well in terms of pension funds as well. So that's where I felt there was a financial literacy piece that had to be done, but also in terms of technology, a lot of the websites were very poor. There wasn't online trading at the time. Since then, we've had James Turk and gold money, and we've had bullion vault. We've had the industry has evolved and become much more sophisticated than back then. But anyway, I realized it was a huge opportunity. Set up the company in 2003, and I suppose we've grown slowly but surely. It's been a long, hard slog and a labor of love, because I really believe in what we do. And we've grown today to, we've over 4,000 clients in over, I think it's 46 countries. And although there's one or two countries there were some of these small little countries that, anyway, sometimes one of the salespeople says it's 50, someone else says it's 46. So we're thereabouts, and but we have a large following in the States, and that's indeed in recent months. That's where we're getting a lot of our business, because we've focused more on the storage in recent months, particularly the Swiss storage, the Singapore storage, because that's where the market was going, and that's where we were getting demand. And we said, right, well, let's focus on that. And people want the geographic diversification, So that's where we're at, and that's it in a nutshell.
There certainly is, not just owning precious metals, but being diversified in where it's held. And you mentioned Singapore, Switzerland. You can store it almost any place in the world now, and then you take the risk associated with. There are various players with various storage offerings on it, but it's very, very important, and then how it's segregated, etc. Maybe we'll have a chance to get into that a little bit later. Mark,
absolutely, yeah.
Mark, we're here to talk about. I want to talk about bail-ins and the whole movement in the banking since Cyprus and what it means and where it's going. But before we just jump into that, this is part of our series on financial repression. And clearly this is part of financial repression. These kinds of regulatory, we call them ring fencing, where they put people in very difficult positions intentionally. And in this case, they expose you to taking a lot of excess risk. Now, can you describe to our listeners what the words financial repression mean to you?
Yeah, I suppose I believe in free markets. I believe in freedom of movement, freedom of capital, and allowing people to make economic decisions for themselves and investment decisions for themselves. I believe in diversification, and but unfortunately, given the huge levels of debt that are in the world today, we are seeing. I suppose it's almost anti-free market philosophies, whereby the governments don't like the price signal, they don't like the price mechanism, so they're trying to. I suppose the primary version of financial repression we see today is the repression that we see in the bond market. I mean, that's the biggest one that you can see in terms of quantitative easing, and just the huge scale of the trillions and trillions of dollars, pounds, yen, and more recently euros that have been printed, and all that is to do is to repress interest rates. But the concern is any of this repression, we use the analogy, other people use as well, it's like the beach ball, the classic beach ball, and you push that down underneath the pool. You're on holidays in the pool with your children, and you push the beach ball down under the water in the pool, down, down, down. The more you push the pressure down on that beach ball, the more it's going to shoot up out of the water, So we would have a concern that by artificially suppressing these various markets, and particularly the price mechanism, that I suppose you're lulling people into a false sense of security. You're creating, I suppose, artificial markets that aren't sort of truly priced, and that can lead to, we're already seeing more and more volatility, but that can lead to actually the opposite, because if you push a market all the way in one direction for a period of time, it can actually bounce in the opposite direction, and it could perversely lead to very poor outcomes, particularly in terms of the interest rates, because they push interest rates to zero. But longer term, it means most likely that interest rates will potentially bounce much, much higher, So I suppose that's the classic example but there's a huge amount of different examples in terms of capital controls. Increasingly, there's a lot of sounds about this, like a war on cash, and this talk of trying to outlaw cash. And then I suppose we're going to come to the more recent phenomenon, which is just, I think it's crazy, and the ramifications of it haven't been thought through, which is the bail-ins, as we saw in Cyprus, and the majority of the Western world don't realize that what happened in Cyprus is that's now enshrined in much of the legislation throughout the Western world, and it's most likely, quite possibly, could be seen in Greece even in the coming days. It's going to be interesting to see what happens there. So yeah, that would be, I suppose, the view on that.
Yeah, and I like your word. It's enshrined in terms of the bail-ins. It has been put into legislation around the world without really the public aware of it at all. just those who are doing a lot of reading and following it. It's been
Yeah.
totally unadvertised and it hasn't even been subtle. But well, maybe we just jump right in. What is a bank bail-in for somebody who has never heard that terminology before, and maybe how it happened in Cyprus, which kind of might give us a template of what others have done.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in effect, it's a bail-in is a deposit confiscation or a savings confiscation. So it's basically going into people's bank accounts, not just people's, but also companies as well. So what happened in Cyprus was above 100,000. There was a guarantee below 100,000. Above 100,000 was basically it was bailed in. It was confiscated in effect. So they suffered a haircut. Ordinarily, what happens when a bank has gone to the wall in the modern era and the modern era of financial regulation, banking regulation, ordinarily what would happen would be that the shareholders obviously get burnt and the share price goes to zero if a bank goes bankrupt in effect, and then next in line would be the junior bondholders and then the senior bondholders, and the depositors were always, I suppose, sacrosanct, and we also had the FDIC and other countries around the world had their deposit insurance. So what happened in Cyprus was, for the first time, depositors, they're in the firing line in effect, and at the time, it was positioned as to suggest that, well, this is a one-off. There's a lot of sort of very hot Russian money down there. These oligarchs have the money down Russian. This is a one-off in Cyprus. It won't be seen anywhere else. It's a unique situation, and these Cypriots have a lot of hot money down there. So don't worry about it. It's nothing to be seen here. Move swiftly along. Nothing to be worried about in the Western world. But we had a lot of both our clients and also the following that we have out there on the internet. And the community that we've built up over the years, and they were emailing us and they're calling saying, what has happened in Cyprus, and could that happen in the US or in the UK? And we honestly said to them, listen, we don't think so. The powers that be, the Troika, the ECB, the IMF, everybody is saying that this, and all the experts are saying that this is a one-off. But people are saying, well, I'm not sure, and this is a precedent, and precedents are important. And how do you know that it couldn't happen? So we said, okay, we have to go and do some research on this. So we decided to do a research report on it, and it's one of the biggest biggest undertakings we've ever done in terms of research, because we tend to do a short, snappy daily, because people have an appetite for daily information. Because I suppose so many things happening in the world today, in terms of the news cycle is there's a lot of things happening. But we did a big 60-page piece on bail-ins, and we were actually surprised by how advanced the legislation was, at very, very high levels. It's basically coming from the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, and then into the various central banks. The Bank of England was very, very active with it, and indeed your own FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So people don't realize how advanced it is, and it is. There's a guy that he was actually, I think he was the third highest guy in the Bank of England, Paul Tucker, and the Bank of England had a joint conference with the FDIC. And that Paul Tucker said that the bail-in legislation is in place. It's in place in the US, and he said, and I quote, "Bail-ins could happen in the US today, and I mean today." So, and yet the vast majority of the American public aren't aware of this. The vast majority of the public internationally aren't aware of it, And so it's barely reported. Another development that was quite interesting, it was just there last year. I brought it up just to remind myself what happened. So Stanley Fischer, who is potentially the heir to the throne and potentially looks like may take over from Yellen, he had a conference there in nearly a year ago now. So it was August last year, 10 months ago. He basically said that regarding US bail-ins, he said, we're preparing a proposal regarding bail-ins. It was the first time he ever spoke publicly after he was made I think he's the vice chairman in effect, Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he was at a conference in Stockholm. Basically said that, I'm just bringing it up here just to see exactly what he said. Yes, he said regarding risks in banks, and that he basically said the United States is preparing a proposal to require systematic systemically important banks to issue bail-inable long-term debt that will enable insolvent banks to recapitalize themselves in resolution without calling on government funding. This cushion is known as gone concern buffer. So eBay said we're preparing a proposal, but that's somewhat at odds with what the FDIC have said, and indeed what the Bank of England officials said in terms of that the bail-in legislation could be used today, you know. So, but they're the very, I suppose, the high-level people who've talking about it. Besides that, there isn't a huge amount of I suppose, documented evidence. There's very little reporting of it, but we know it's there. That the EU has actually brought forward their bail-in legislation, and as I said, it's coming through the BIS, and many of the G20 nations are adopting them, including Australia, Canada, and as I said, most of the Western nations. So it's there, and the thing about the deposit guarantee is another thing. People say, oh, it's a good reason to diversify banks, and what you should have is 999 in each bank account, because that way you'll be protected from haircuts potentially if this happens above the 100,000 level again. But that's an arbitrary figure, that 100,000. So, you know, I think with the the stroke of a pen, they could quickly change that to 50,000 or 80,000, particularly in light of the fact that many people have diversified with 99,999, you know. So that's something to be aware of as well.
Yeah, when they bring out these kinds of legislation, the number is usually made high enough that you say, well, yeah, I'm not going to be impacted. And then quickly what happens is the number gets brought down very, very quickly. But it doesn't get any advertising. There's just no visibility on it. Yeah, and it's a trial balloon. They get it through, and then they start to really tune it. And this is something that only the regulators right now may know. So in America, we'd say, oh, we're FDIC insured. That I'm deposits only very, very large money. I saw it was over $100 million that you would be exposed, et cetera. That's just not the case. The example of that, just to bring it on point, it used to be that if you were an expat in America and you worked out in another country, there was no duplicate taxation. You paid the tax in the UK if you were there, or in Canada where you were. But they said if you make over $500,000 a year, then in fact America gets that taxation because it has citizen taxation, and everybody said as an expat, no problems. And that number has been steadily brought down to the point that I just found out the other day. I thought it was up at $200,000, $300,000. It's now $108,000, which means if you're an expat around the world, you're making over $100,000. You're paying tax to the country you're in, and then after that, both of them tax you.
Yeah. It's a bit like we're all little frogs in a pot of cold water, and they just keep turning up the heat.
Precisely, and the reason I'm using that as an example. That shows you the grab that's going on taxation. And when you look at FATCA and how it's restricting, when you look at PFIC and foreign investment, passive investment, these are forms of capital control. So the bigger issue becomes the banks themselves. And we get into a cashless society where they won't let you pull the money out of the banks, or because it's cashless, it's always going to stay within the banking network. And then if the banks collapse, as you said, it's equity holders get killed, and then we're supposed to go up with the capital structure, but really what we do is we end up grabbing the depositors' money, which is a terrifying issue. And just the last point, I know you mentioned the capital structure within the banks. They start with the juniors and work their way up. But people don't really fully realize you don't really want to own a bank. I mean, if you're a large-scale money manager or in wealth, you have a large amount of wealth. What you really want to do is be the senior note holder in the bank. And by senior secured, you're the last one. You're the most secure. And so even if a bank's not making very much money, you get 6% every year, no risk, and it comes out. They've been losing, and you still get your 6% because they take that out and pay before they get to their profits.
There's a seniority,
it's no risk. It's the senior secured, and that's where the real money is and the real power in the banks. Everybody thinks it's in who owns the equities. The fact that I haven't heard whether the senior secured actually get a haircut. All the rest do, absolutely, but and try and get the small print of whether they'll get, because that's where the real capital is, just as an aside. Yeah, for those that aren't aware of how the banking industry truly works.
No, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head, and that's exactly how it works. And people just aren't aware of it, you know. And what's outrageous as well, it's been done on the pretext that they're doing it to protect taxpayers. But the depositors are taxpayers too, you know. So the way they justify it is they're saying, well, if a bank gets into difficulty again, we don't want to bail them out with taxpayers' money. And it's like, well, first of all, in Ireland and many of these countries, and we've direct experience of this in Ireland, what happened was the taxpayers, and what's said is that Ireland was bailed out. Well, Ireland wasn't bailed out. It was European banks that lent irresponsibly to Irish banks, including these senior bondholders that you're talking about. That's exactly what you were saying. The European banks, German banks, UK banks, French banks lent irresponsibly to Irish banks, who then lent irresponsibly to Irish people who borrowed irresponsibly. And there's two parts to the equation. You have to acknowledge that as well. But then those banks got bailed out, and the senior bondholders got bailed out. So and now
the senior secured always get protected.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anybody else gets thrown to the wind. Senior secured, and they're the ones with the political influence.
Absolutely.
That force the politicians to make the deals.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a way to protect the larger banks, and I think that's the primary motivation of it, and these are the guys who control the BIS, and they're basically formulating this legislation. But the concern is, and I think that there's twofold concern. One is you're concerned about the financial repression aspect, and that indeed is absolutely huge and vitally important, particularly for anybody who is giving investment advice to people out there about what to do with their finances. But there's also a huge risk in terms of the wider economy, and I don't think the ramifications of this have been thought through, because the powers that be claim that they're fighting deflation, and that's why they have to print trillions and trillions, and that's why they have to repress interest rates and have interest rates at 0%. If you bail in depositors and you bail in one of the primary sources of capital that's out there in the wider economy, and you confiscate that capital, you confiscate that cash, that is going to create deflation like you will not believe, and it's going to create. I would think it will create another, and it's seen in Cyprus indeed, because basically you're taking money from people who have capital to spend, whether it be to create business, to buy assets, to buy cars, whatever it is, to spend in the wider economy. If you take that money from them, that money won't come into the economy. You won't see the velocity of money. And in terms of confidence as well, I mean, if you imagine you're a small, medium enterprise and they come in and they take money that you would use for your payroll, so it will actually lead to, I think, consumer confidence would be badly impacted. I think trade would be badly impacted, commerce. To me, it's socialism of the worst kind. It's very, very anti-capitalistic, and it goes against the entire capitalistic system that's been built up over the years. And I suppose to me, it's almost like we've had this slow death of 1,000 cuts for years now. But this to me is like the final hammer blow potentially. So and you just hope that maybe wisdom may prevail and they may pull back from it, because to me it's a nuclear option if they pull the trigger on it. But I suppose all eyes, Greece will be, what happens in Greece in the coming days will be very important to see.
Watch it closely.
Yeah.
What the final deal looks like.
Exactly.
And who is protected, get haircuts in it. But if looking at the Greece deal, what's the argument? Greece is saying, well, we can make the difference up on future revenue streams, and here's what the revenue and the growth is going to be, and he'll balance it. And everybody else in the IMF and the Troika and the other side says, no, it's not about futures. We want you to cut. We want you to cut pensions. We want you to put the VAT in. We want money now. And we, in other words, we want it really secured. But we'll wait and we'll see how the dust settles. But these rules are unfolding in terms of bailouts, and they're so subtle. And right now we're seeing the same group that was talking up bail-ins are now, and I'm referring to the latest European finance ministers meeting in Dresden, Germany, where they're in there talking about a cashless society and having to move quickly to cash. And by cashless, we need to, there's all sorts of reasons why we think we don't need cash in terms of credit cards. But what we need to understand is, once you can't take it out of the banking system, because if it's cashless, it's in the banks. All you're doing is have the right to transfer it for some kind of payment scheme. But that can change very quickly, where there's cost to do it, and once it's in the banking system, where is it? It could be in government bonds. It could be your pension system. You can't even get it out. So the first rule is, if you can't withdraw money from the banking system, you've lost control. You can't do anything with the banks. The banks are totally in control as a society. And that I quickly see is that everybody says, well, I don't need my credit card, my debit card, and the costs associated with it are very high. If I if I run up debt. That's not really the issue. Really on your credit card is the seller, the store is paying huge fees. And if we went to a cashless society, those fees would go through the roof from the banks on the other side. So you'd be in even more money. And so there's just so many, there's a litany. I've written a number of papers on all of the issues with it, but it doesn't make any difference. They're going to push this through. And it's all part of it, and it ties in with the bail-ins. But Mark, right back to the bail-ins. How does somebody protect themselves? What's the protection against this?
Well, it's the old cliche of having your eggs in different baskets. People forget about it, but it's just common sense. You need to be diversified. You need to own a range of different assets, and and you need to be diversified globally as well. So, whether it's equities, bonds, we would say if you're going to own equities, you own an institutional fund that's an index fund that's very, very low cost. There's risks in that, so you don't over allocate to equities, particularly with equities all-time record highs. In terms of bonds, we would think you would go high credit, very short duration. So look at your Switzerlands, your Norways, your Singapore, your Hong Kongs, your AAA rated. I know the credit rating agencies haven't done a great job, but these countries are creditor nations in the world, and therefore, in worst case scenarios, their bonds should, I would think they would maintain their value and preserve wealth better than other bonds. In terms of cash, you need to be diversified, and you need to have some cash outside the system. Exactly what you're talking about there in terms of they're trying to create this. It's in Argentina, they call it the corralito. And it's like a corral. They're corralling your money in the system. They want to keep it all there in the system so they can control it, they can monitor it, and and they can use it. So potentially they'll use some of that cash to support the bond market and just to maintain this repression, So they don't want people having options, and cash gives people, and cash and indeed gold gives people, I suppose, freedom and independence, So diversify your cash. Multiple jurisdictions. I mean, that's easy for a very high net worth person, but it's harder for your smaller guy. But your smaller guy can do maybe two banks in two countries, and some in the States, a safer bank in the States, and some in a safer bank internationally, And then, of course, gold and silver, I think everybody should have an allocation. We've always said 5 to 10%. I think given the risk today, we're saying more 10, 20%, and make sure, as you said at the outset, it has to be physical, it has to be allocated, it has to be segregated, it has to be owned in bailment, which means you are the outright legal owner of that bullion. Any bullion dealer provider who sells it to you, if you own gold or silver in that way, it doesn't matter what happens to them. You have a direct relationship to the depository, and make sure you own it in the safest depositories, in the safest jurisdictions in the world. But you have a direct relationship, and therefore it doesn't matter what happens. You can always take delivery of that bullion, or you can pick up the phone to dozens of bullion dealers around the world and say, I have X amount of gold or silver in the vault in Zurich, in Salt Lake City, in Singapore, wherever it is, and I want to take delivery, or I want to sell it to you. What's your price? And the beauty of that is, if you own actual individual coins and bars, you can you're not a price taker, because you can. I've got 100 American Eagles in the vault. What price will you give me? And one bullion dealer will say, well, I'll give you 1% premium below spot. Then you get on the phone to another bullion dealer and you get the most competitive price for your bullion. But if you go through, I suppose, an online trading platform, or you go through some of these web online portals, you are a price taker in effect, and you're very dependent on the price that platform gives you. So there's a little bit more risk in that. And don't get me wrong, there are some very good providers in that space, particularly Gold Money. But there is a bit of risk there, because if a bank took over one of these online portals, the spreads could increase very, very widely, and that speaks to your financial repression argument as well. So precious metals are very valuable in terms of it's that global diversification. It's also just liquidity, and also their store of value. They will retain value. They may go lower in the short term, but over the medium and long term, we think they'll possibly outperform, and they will act as a diversification and as a hedging instrument, as they have done in both in recent times and throughout history.
I'm not trying to pick on the banks with my comment here, Mark, but there was a need for banks because, if you put your deposits in, you made a decent interest rate and it was a place to save. Well, they don't pay you anything. Matter of fact, with your fees and everything else, you'll find that you're paying to have the money stored, and to go to cashless, you'll be charged to keep it there. They're certainly not lending, unless you've got significant kinds of collateral, at least here in the United States. And that's why we have the bank reserves at, approaching $3 trillion, excess bank reserves. So the question I'm getting to is, with bail-ins, et cetera, why would you keep your money in a bank today, other than as a utility, just for your credit card kind of transaction, a minimum amount to have it operating as a utility? Why would you? And I'm not trying to disparage the bank, but have they now changed the rules to where they're no longer something you should be using? There are other ways of controlling your money and your wealth.
I think they have, and I think people are increasingly going to use banks purely for as you said, their day-to-day expenses, their current account, because what's the point of having a savings account if you have all this risk and you're not getting any yield? So you have all the risk and you don't have the reward, and that's a basic tenet of capitalism, that the more risk you take, you tend to get more of a yield. You see that particularly obviously in the bond market, whereas today you have the risk of bail-ins and haircuts that you didn't have before, and you're not getting a yield. So, the whole cash on the mattress thing, you don't want to be telling people to put cash on the mattress because it's a risk in doing that. So, I suppose you have to do it in a safe way. Safety deposit boxes nearby are an option, but you need to be careful who the counterparties are in that regard as well, But I do think there is, we covered actually during the week, it was very unusual, one of the biggest bond fund managers in the UK, a guy called Mr. Spreadbury, who works for Fidelity. And he basically said, and it's amazing for a bond manager to say this, he said that people should own cash, physical cash, outside the system. And that's amazing for a major bond fund manager to be saying that. And he also recommended precious metals as well, So I think there's a realization there that deposits are no longer the safe sort of widows and orphans vehicle that they should be, which is, it's terrible, because it's the most vulnerable in society use these instruments to save and to protect their wealth, and yet they're no longer safe, it's the whole thing is absolutely crazy. It's insane, and unfortunately I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. We'll come through it, but given the scale of the imbalances, it looks like we may get major dislocations before we come to our senses and we get some sort of wisdom prevailing in terms of what we need to do with these banks. I think Dodd-Frank is a big thing as well in terms of, you've probably spoken about that. I mean, that to me is a huge thing, to separate the casino risk-taking part of the banks and all these kids they have trading markets with massive leverage away from the widows and orphans of deposits. I mean, that was just one of the fundamental things they should have done, and they botched it once again,
And they did botch it. But they served neither side of that, as making it a utility versus being a prop desk, and stopping them speculating with high leverage with your deposits as opposed to operating a utility. So they haven't made them utilities. They have tried to restrict the prop debt, and what that has done is just completely bled the liquidity out of the bond market and the repo market. So they're no longer market makers. They're acting as agents, finding a buy and seller. They're not in it. And right now, I'm personally very, very concerned about the slowing liquidity, the ability, and if they suddenly there's a scare where some of the bond dealers at elevated prices right now, low yield, start to want to switch and rebalance. They can't do it. They can't get a fill on their orders. And that will cause huge spikes in volatility and can lead to like a fire in a theater. And I'm not alone in that. The FINRA has just called emergency meetings with the banks to talk about this problem, with work up a plan here for the first part of July. That's not saying the world's coming to an end. It's clearly a problem that's been created out of it. And with Basel III and the capital requirements, they've almost preordained another serious issue. Well, we'll see how quickly they react here. But something like Greece could really potentially trigger a melt up in how they do it. That's why I do believe there will be collateral guarantee in some way, but that's just a personal opinion. Time the tape's out, this tape is out, people listening will say, this is what they did. So we'll find Mark, we have to wrap here. Any last comments you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Well, I suppose just on the bond market, I agree with you. I think that liquidity thing, it's becoming more and more of an issue. I think the OECD warned about it quite unusually in recent days. Yeah. And I'm actually attending a conference in Monaco now next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's Funds Forum International, so it has some of the CEOs of all the big financial institutions and banks internationally, some of the regulators, a lot of the who's in the industry, and a lot of the focus is actually on liquidity in the bond market, and then the potential impact that that will have in the CDS market and the interest rate swaps and interest rate derivatives. So yeah, I think that's and Greece could be the catalyst, and Ukraine is actually in the background there as well. There's huge issues with Ukraine that nobody's talking about, but they are bankrupt as well, and there is potential CDS issues there. But it's just amazing that this is exactly what we said would happen when they started printing money and said that we're going to buy government debt. The ECB in particular in recent months is a classic example of it. The ECB told us in advance we're going to print 1 trillion euros and we're going to buy government debt. So all these banks and all these hedge funds and all these pension funds and everybody piled in advance of the QE, which they knew was coming. So now it's an effective shot their gun. They all the capital is allocated because they knew we need to get ahead of this, because the ECB is going to be buying. It's going to push interest rates or push the price of the bonds to very high levels and the interest rate lower. So now they're surprised that there's a lack of liquidity. I mean, it's pretty inevitable, But anyway, there's a complete lack of common sense, and I think that creates risks, and people just need to be aware of these risks, and we'll come through these things. But I do think, where this leads ultimately, this financial repression that you're an expert on, is to, Argentina-style sort of capital controls and collapses in effect, and we saw it in Russia as well, in USSR, and issues with ATMs and getting your money out. So you need to take some of your money out of the system as a diversification, and I think that's the fundamental message,
Get out. So you don't have counterparty risks that can explode, which is usually what happens when there's a liquidity problem. Get yourself where you have some level of independence, and hopefully it doesn't happen. They don't underestimate their ability to keep kicking this can down the road. But when it goes on this long, you get malinvestment, then you get lack of price discovery, you get mispricing of risk. Well, that's actually what starts the whole thing. So the whole system becomes very fragile. Yeah. And then you start to patch it up. And we'll patch it up here with this liquidity issue. I'm assuming, because when you know there's a problem, you can usually start to work on it. It's the problem you don't know you have that comes out of nowhere. But when the system becomes this fragile, it just takes something to break somewhere for unexpected reason to suddenly cascade, and you can't react quickly. That's what happens when it's this long and this is. It's like, why don't trees grow to the sky? Well, they keep growing. Well, why do they? What's going to stop them, right? Well, at some point they just become unstable, and a butterfly, whatever, and it's just enough for them to come. You never know quite when it is, but after 7 years of zero interest rate and never having done it, the amount of malinvestment that we have right now, it's very unstable on a globalized basis, but. That doesn't mean it can't go on for a period much longer, but it does said that when it corrects, it'll be even more violent,
absolutely,
and more difficult to address. So,
yeah,
and
potentially.
I like your comment about would cooler heads prevail, but we haven't seen that.
No, unfortunately, and I think it will lead to some form of collapse potentially, but I'm not an Armageddonist. I don't think there's a new Mad Max movie that's just come out, I'm not that sort of scenario, but I do think you could see dislocation for a period of weeks or short months, and that's particularly when these more liquid instruments that you've taken out of the system will really come to your aid, and again, that's a worst case. Well, it's not actually worst case scenario, but it's quite a bad scenario. But we have to all operate in the basis that these are real risks and prepare accordingly, and all hope for the best, but be prepared for these less benign scenarios.
We've never seen risks at a greater level, and I go back a lot of years. And you lived through 1987. I went through the .com bubble, obviously 2008. And we're much higher levels of risk all the way along, but it doesn't mean something imminent's about to happen. It's just that why do we keep building the system to create these kinds of risk? There's something fundamentally flawed in our regulatory and our political system, or there's massive imbalances that our system can't correct as the world has went globalized, and we haven't adjusted with restructuring, IMFs, Bretton Woods 3, if I can call it that, World Bank. These things aren't doing their job. For whatever kinds of reasons. Mark, we have to wrap. Can you tell our listeners how they could follow your writings and your research and Goldcore?
Yeah, so the website is goldcore.com, goldcore.com. You can sign up for our daily update or weekly update or more periodic research piece that we would do. And you can follow us on the usual Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and those various social media channels. And we have I think we've about 31,000 people who have opted in, who are receiving some form of research from us, whether it be the daily, the weekly, or the research pieces. So people are very engaged, and I suppose sometimes I feel a bit like a tabloid editor. Every day you're under pressure to come up with something new and a new angle, and sometimes it's not of a quality that I would like, but generally we come up with some very good stuff and some good angles, and I think people will, whether it's not the daily, it might be too much for some people, but I think the weekly is a good sort of summary of what's gone on in the week and give you a good flavour of what's happening in both the gold market and also the wider markets as well.
You mentioned earlier, before I let go, the 70-page thereabouts report that you originally wrote in the bail-ins. Is that available on your site at all?
It is, yeah. And there's a guy, if you go to knowledge, it's sort of the top right of the page is a knowledge page, and there's a drop-down box here where it has guides, and it should be in there. And I'll email it on to you as well, Gordon. I think you'll really enjoy it. We had one of the leading finance professors. He's actually one of the most leading finance professors in the world. He's written dozens of papers, and he wrote the foreword to it. And so it's very sort of empirical, very fact-based, and brought a lot of strands together. And I think we have a 60-page, which may be a bit much for a lot of people, and we have a shortened version of it, like a summary version of about 10 pages. So there's two different versions of it, and your listeners can decide which one they want to read.
Appreciate the time. Always enjoy these kinds of conversations, and we'll have to have you back later in the year.
Absolutely, really enjoyed it, Gordon, and very interesting interview. And it's always great to have sort of informed questions. It makes for a more fluid and an interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
Talk to you again. Bye-bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.